The air was crisp as I stepped out of my truck, the early morning sun barely cresting the rugged peaks of Glacier National Park. My boots crunched against the gravel of the parking lot, the only sound besides the distant rustle of the wind through the evergreens. This was what I'd come for, the solitude, the rawness of the wilderness, and the chance to disconnect from the buzzing demands of modern life. I hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, its weight reassuring. Inside were the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, food, and a small hatchet for cutting firewood. My bear spray was holstered on my belt, a constant reminder of where I was. Glacier was no stranger to grizzlies, and every ranger's warning I'd ever heard about bear safety echoed in my mind. "Hey there," a ranger's voice broke through the silence. He was a stocky man, wearing the telltale green uniform and wide-brimmed hat of the National Park Service. His name tag read Williams. "Morning," I replied, adjusting the straps of my pack. "Heading out alone?" Williams asked, his tone friendly but tinged with concern. "Yeah, just a couple of nights. Wanted to get away from it all," I said, forcing a smile. "Well, keep that bear spray handy," he said, tapping the canister on his own belt. "This time of year, they're pretty active. Had a couple of sightings near Lake Josephine last week." "Thanks for the heads up. I'll be careful," I assured him. "Good. Remember, no sudden moves if you see one, and don't run. Talk to it. Calmly and back away slowly," he said, his eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge whether I'd take his advice seriously. I nodded, offering a quick, "Got it," before heading toward the trailhead. The first few miles of the hike were invigorating. The trail wound through dense forests of pine and fir, the earthy scent of the woods filling my lungs. Birds flitted between the trees, their songs blending into a melody that felt like nature's own symphony. My boots found their rhythm on the packed dirt, and I allowed my thoughts to wander, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. By midday, I'd reached a small clearing where I decided to set up camp. The spot was perfect, nestled between towering pines with a clear view of a sparkling creek that wound its way down from the mountains. I pitched my tent quickly, the practiced motions bringing a sense of satisfaction. After a quick lunch of trail mix and jerky, I decided to gather some firewood to prepare for the cold night ahead. Grabbing my hatchet, I ventured deeper into the woods, marking my trail with small notches on tree trunks. The shadows grew longer as the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, but I was confident I'd find my way back. The forest felt alive, in a way that was both comforting and unnerving. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot seemed amplified. But it wasn't until I came across the shredded bark of a fallen log that a chill ran down my spine. Scattered around it were fresh claw marks, deep gouges that could only have been made by something large, something powerful. I knelt down to get a closer look, my fingers tracing the marks. Grizzly, I thought, my heart skipping a beat. William's warning replayed in my head. They're pretty active this time of year. I stood and scanned the trees, the vibrant greens and browns suddenly feeling more like camouflage than a serene backdrop. "All right, time to head back," I muttered to myself, my voice sounding small and thin in the vastness of the forest. As I turned to retrace my steps, a faint sound reached my ears, a low guttural huff. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as my heart began to pound. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable rustle of something large moving through the underbrush. "Easy," I whispered, gripping the hatchet tightly in one hand, while my other hovered near the bear spray. "It's just the woods playing tricks on you." But then I saw it. Through the dense foliage, a massive grizzly emerged, its fur ablend of deep browns and silvers catching the dappled sunlight. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its dark eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, neither of us moved, the forest holding its breath. I remembered the ranger's words. "Talk to it calmly." My voice trembled as I said, "Hey, big guy, it's okay. I'm just passing through. No harm meant." The bear huffed again, lowering its massive head as it took a step forward. My mind raced. Every survival tip I'd ever heard colliding in a chaotic mess. I knew running was the worst thing I could do, but every instinct screamed at me to flee. Another step, and the bear's size became more overwhelming. Its sheer bulk made the trees around it seem small, insignificant. I took a slow step back, my boots crunching on the dry twigs and leaves. The sound seemed to set the bear off. It reared up on its hind legs, towering over me, and let out a deep, resonant roar that seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet. "No!" I shouted, fumbling for the bear spray, but my hands were shaking too much to get a good grip. "Stay back!" The bear dropped back onto all fours and lunged forward a few feet, stopping abruptly as if testing me. My heart was in my throat, every breath shallow and rapid. I forced myself to take another step back, my eyes never leaving the bear. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the grizzly turned its head and sniffed the air, its ears flicking back. It lingered for a moment before lumbering off into the woods, its massive form disappearing into the shadows. I stood frozen, my chest heaving as I tried to process what had just happened. My hands were still clenched around the hatchet and bear spray, my knuckles white. It felt like an eternity before I could will my legs to move. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, my voice cracking. The adrenaline coursing through my veins left me shaky and weak as I stumbled back toward camp, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Every sound, every movement in the trees made me flinch. When I finally reached the clearing, I collapsed by the fire pit, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest no longer felt serene. It felt like a predator's hunting ground. And for the first time, I realized how small and vulnerable I truly was in its vast, indifferent embrace. The campfire crackled as I sat huddled on a log, the heat barely cutting through the growing chill of evening. My mind replayed the unsettling moment from earlier, the fresh claw marks on the fallen log, a silent warning I'd tried to dismiss. The forest around me was eerily quiet now, the earlier symphony of birdsong and rustling leaves replaced by an almost oppressive stillness. I stirred the fire with a stick, trying to calm my nerves. "No reason to panic," I muttered to myself. "Just another night in the woods." But the unease in my gut refused to settle. Every shadow beyond the flickering firelight seemed to shift and breathe with a life of its own. The sudden snap of a branch made me jerk upright, the stick clattering. To the ground. My hand instinctively went to the bear spray on my belt. "Probably just a deer," I whispered, though the tremor in my voice betrayed my doubt. My eyes scanned the dark forest, searching for movement, but the firelight could only reach so far. The crackling of leaves and a low, guttural sound broke. The silence, a noise that sent a chill racing down my spine. It wasn't a deer. I stood slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by the heavy rhythm of something large pushing through the underbrush. Then I saw it, a massive grizzly bear, its fur shimmering in the firelight. Its eyes gleamed with an almost unnatural intensity, locking onto me as if I were the only thing in its world. "Hey, easy," I stammered, raising my hand slightly. The bear spray gripped tightly in one. "I'm not here to bother you, just passing through." The bear snorted, a deep and guttural sound that made my legs feel like they'd turned to water. It took a step closer, its massive paws silent on the forest floor, its breath visible in the cool night air. My mouth went dry as I fought to remember everything I'd been taught about bear encounters. "Stay calm. Don't run," I whispered. To myself, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my pulse. The bear's head tilted slightly as it took another step forward, its black nose twitching as it sniffed the air. My mind raced, searching for anything that might diffuse the situation. Slowly, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a granola bar. "Here," I said, my voice trembling. I tossed the bar a few feet in front of me, hoping to distract the bear. The granola bar landed with a soft thud, but the bear barely glanced at it. Instead, it took another deliberate step closer. Okay, I muttered, my grip tightening on the bear spray. My thumb hovered over the safety, ready to deploy it if the bear got too close. Then, with a suddenness that made me flinch, the bear reared onto its hind legs. It stood impossibly tall, its bulk dominating the space between us. The firelight danced across its muscular frame, casting long, menacing shadows. It let out a deep, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground, through my very bones. I took a slow step backward, my free hand raised in what I hoped was a placating gesture. "It's okay, big guy. No need to." Before I could finish, the bear dropped back onto all fours with a heavy thud, its growl turning into a snarl. It pawed at the ground, its claws raking the dirt as if to remind me just how outmatched I was. I forced myself to speak, my voice wavering but steady enough. "I'm backing away now, all right? Nice and slow." The bear's gaze never left mine as I took another step back, then another. The tension was suffocating, each second stretching into an eternity. The forest seemed to close in around us, the firelight flickering wildly as if caught in the same fear that gripped me. Suddenly, the bear's ears flicked back, and it turned, its head sharply toward the trees behind it. It sniffed the air again, its body language shifting subtly. Whatever had caught its attention seemed to take precedence over me. With one last huff, the bear turned and lumbered off into the darkness, its massive form swallowed by the shadows of the forest. I stood frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the bear spray. It wasn't until the forest returned to its heavy silence that I dared to move. I sank onto the log by the fire, my legs weak beneath me. The granola bar lay untouched a few feet away, a stark reminder of how close I'd come to disaster. The fire crackled softly, its warmth doing little to chase away the chill that had settled into my bones. "That was too close," I murmured, running a trembling hand through my hair. My mind reeled, replaying every detail of the encounter, every decision I'd made. For a moment, I considered packing up and leaving, but the thought of navigating the dark trail back to the truck felt just as dangerous as staying. Instead, I grabbed my water bottle and took a long, shaky sip, trying to calm my racing heart. I needed to stay alert, to be ready in case the bear returned. But the forest's oppressive silence weighed heavily on me, each creak of a branch or whisper of wind setting my nerves on edge. I reached for my radio, hoping for some comfort in a voice other than my own. "This is Eric Tanner, Campsite 4, I said, my voice hoarse. "Had a close encounter with a grizzly. No injuries, but it's still nearby, just putting it on record." The radio crackled before a voice responded. "Copy that, Tanner. Keep your fire going and stay vigilant. We'll send someone to check. In the morning." "Understood," I replied, setting the radio down. Morning felt like an eternity away. The fire popped loudly, making me jump. I stared into the flames, the bear's dark eyes still vivid in my mind. The wilderness no longer felt serene or inviting. It felt like a predator waiting to strike. For the first time, I truly understood how small and fragile I was out here. As the hours dragged on, I fought to stay awake. Every sound outside the sea, firelight a potential threat. The memory of the bear's towering form and its guttural growl refused to fade. I could only hope that the night would pass without further incident, leaving me with nothing but scars, on my skin and in my mind, to carry back home. The morning air was sharp and cold, carrying the metallic tang of dew-soaked earth. I'd barely slept, my nerves too frayed from the encounter the night before. Every creak and rustle had pulled me back into the vivid memory of the grizzly, its sheer size and presence seared into my mind. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the dense canopy, I tried to push aside the lingering dread. I needed more firewood. That was the only way to keep myself safe. The fire's glow had been my one comfort through the long, restless hours of the night. I grabbed the hatchet and slipped on my jacket, its weight a familiar reassurance. The me. Forest seemed less menacing in the light of day, but my instinct still screamed caution. I traced my steps carefully, avoiding areas thick with underbrush where visibility was poor. "You got this, Eric," I murmured, steeling myself as I moved deeper into the woods. A distant snap of a branch made me freeze. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. "It's probably nothing," I told myself, though my grip on the hatchet tightened. Every shadow seemed to shift, every patch of sunlight a potential hiding place for something far larger than me. As I bent down to pick up a dry branch, a deep, low growl rumbled through the air. It wasn't close, but it was close enough. My breath caught in my throat as I straightened, scanning the forest around me. The growl came again, this time louder, more insistent. My stomach churned. "Not again," I whispered, backing away slowly. My heart pounded as the growl shifted into a guttural snarl, the kind that reverberates through your chest. Then I saw it. The grizzly emerged from the underbrush, its massive head low and ears pinned back. It wasn't curious like before. This time it was territorial, its movements deliberate and charged with tension. My fingers trembled around the hatchet as my mind scrambled for options. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Go on, get out of here!" The bear paused, its dark eyes locking onto me. For a moment I thought it might retreat, but then it lowered its head further and took a step forward. My mouth went dry as panic. Clawed at the edges of my thoughts, I knew I had seconds to act. "No!" I yelled, raising the hatchet over my head. "I'm not afraid of you," the grizzly charged. Time seemed to slow as its massive frame barreled toward me, the ground trembling beneath its weight. My survival instincts kicked in, and I swung the hatchet wildly, the blade catching sunlight. As it arced through the air, I missed. The bear's sheer speed and size overwhelmed me. Its shoulder slammed into me like a freight train, sending me sprawling to the ground. Pain exploded in my chest as I landed hard, the hatchet slipping from my grasp. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my eyes locked on the bear as it loomed over me. "No, no, no!" I gasped, fumbling for the bear spray strapped to my belt. My fingers finally found the nozzle, and I ripped it free, aiming shakily. The bear's jaws parted in a deafening roar, its hot breath washing over me as I pressed the trigger. The spray erupted in a fine orange mist, hitting the bear square in the face. It recoiled, shaking its massive head and pouring at its eyes. I didn't waste a second. Rolling onto my knees, I grabbed the hatchet and swung again, this time aiming for the ground between us, trying to make myself look larger and more threatening. "Back off!" I screamed, my voice raw with fear and adrenaline. The bear snarled, its claws raking the ground as it shook off the spray's effects. My legs screamed in protest as I forced myself to stand, every instinct urging me to run, but I knew better. Running would trigger its predatory instincts. I'd read that 100 times. Instead, I kept my eyes locked on it, backing away as slowly as I could manage. The bear huffed, its massive chest rising and falling as it watched me. Then, to my utter disbelief, it lowered itself onto all fours and turned slightly, its attention momentarily diverted by a rustling in the bushes. Another animal, maybe a deer, darted through the trees, and the bear's focus shifted just long enough for me to gain some distance. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. My legs carried me as fast as I dared back toward the camp, the forest blurring around me. Every step felt like a marathon, my lungs burning with the effort. When I finally stumbled into the clearing, I collapsed by the fire pit, my chest heaving. "Holy God," I panted, clutching the hatchet like a lifeline. My hands shook so violently, I could barely keep my grip. The adrenaline began to wear off, replaced by a dull, throbbing pain in my ribs and shoulders. I peeled back my jacket to see long, shallow scratches across my chest where the bear's claws had grazed me. The sight of the blood made my head spin. I fumbled for my radio and pressed the button. "This is Tanner. Campsite 4, I rasped, my voice hoarse. "I've been attacked. Need medical assistance." The response came quickly, a burst of static, followed by a calm, authoritative voice. "Copy that, Tanner. Hold tight. Help is on the way. Are you in immediate danger?" "No. It's gone," I said, leaning my head back against a tree. "But it's still out there." "Understood. Stay by the fire and keep yourself warm. Help will arrive shortly." The radio crackled again before falling silent. I let it drop onto the ground. Beside me, my energy spent. The forest seemed quieter now, as if even the trees were holding their breath. The bear was gone, but its presence lingered like a ghost, haunting every shadow. I closed my eyes and let the fire's warmth wash over me, the faint smell of smoke mixing with the coppery tang of blood. The wilderness had shown its teeth, and I knew I'd never see it the same way again. For now, all I could do was wait, and hope that the worst was behind me. The pain in my ribs was relentless as I staggered toward camp, every step a cruel reminder of the encounter. The forest, now painted in muted tones of dawn, seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, each shadow a potential hiding spot for the grizzly. My mind raced with every possibility. Was it still nearby? Had it doubled back? I forced myself to keep moving. Just a little farther, I muttered, through clenched teeth, gripping the torn strap of my pack. My hatchet dangled loosely from my other hand, my fingers barely able to hold on after the adrenaline crash. The sound of rushing water reached my ears, signaling that I was close to the creek near my camp. Relief flooded me, but it was quickly dampened by the realization that I still wasn't safe. I needed to assess my injuries, secure the perimeter, and prepare for another potential encounter. When I finally stumbled into the clearing, my knees buckled and I collapsed near the fire pit. The ashes from last night's fire were cold and grey, mocking my earlier sense of security. I fumbled for the matches in my pocket and struck one, but my hands were trembling so badly that the flame died almost instantly. "Damn it," I hissed, striking another. This time I managed to light the kindling I'd left by the pit. The small flame grew steadily, and I fed it bits of dry wood until the fire crackled to life. Its warmth was a feeble comfort, but it was something. I shrugged off my jacket, wincing as the movement pulled at the scratches across my chest. The fabric of my shirt stuck to the wounds, and I gritted my teeth as I peeled it away. Blood had dried in jagged lines where the bear's claws had raked me, but the cuts didn't seem deep enough to need stitches. Digging through my pack, I found the small first aid kit and yanked it open. I cleaned the wounds as best I could, the antiseptic stinging like fire. "Come on, Eric, keep it together," I whispered, wrapping gauze around my torso. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. I reached for the radio, my lifeline to the outside world. The ranger had said help would come, but how long could it take? "This is Tanner at Campsite 4, I said, my voice cracking. "Still here, injured but stable. Any update on rescue?" The static-filled reply came moments later. "Tanner, this is Ranger Williams. Helicopters delayed due to weather. Ground teams heading your way. Sit tight." "Copy that," I replied, my throat tightening. Sit tight, I thought bitterly. Easy for them to say. The hours dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. The forest was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you like a physical weight. I kept the fire blazing, its steady crackle, my only companion. Every now and then I thought I heard movement, a rustle in the bushes, the snap of a twig, but when I peered into the trees, there was nothing. My stomach growled, and I realized I hadn't eaten since the day before. I pulled out a protein bar and forced myself to take small bites, though my appetite was non-existent. The act of chewing felt mechanical, my mind too preoccupied with scanning the perimeter for any signs of the grizzly. As the sun climbed higher, the shadows began to recede, but my anxiety didn't. I tried to distract myself by gathering more, firewood staying close to the clearing. Each time I ventured to the edge of the trees, my heart raced, and I gripped the hatchet so tightly my knuckles turned white. By early afternoon I heard it again, the low, guttural sound that had haunted me since the first encounter. I froze, my eyes darting toward the source of the noise. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere beyond the creek. "No," I whispered, backing toward the fire. I grabbed the bear spray and held it ready, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Not again. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic crunch of heavy footfalls. I couldn't see it yet, but I knew it was close. My hands shook as I aimed the spray in the direction of the noise, the nozzle trembling. "Stay away!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "Just go!" A massive shape emerged from the underbrush, and for a moment I thought my heart might stop. But it wasn't the grizzly. It was a ranger clad in a green jacket with a rifle slung over his shoulder. "Tanner!" he called out, his voice firm but calm. I lowered the bear spray, my knees nearly giving out in relief. "Yeah," I managed to croak. "Eric Tanner." The ranger approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the clearing. "Ranger Lewis," he said, offering a curt nod. "You okay?" "I've been better," I admitted, gesturing to the gauze wrapped around my chest. Lewis's expression tightened. "Let's get you patched up properly, and we'll move to a safer location." "Safer?" I echoed. "Where?" "There's a ranger station about a mile east of here," he said, kneeling to check my wounds. "You'll be secure there until the helicopter can extract you." As he worked, I couldn't help but glance toward the trees, half expecting the grizzly to reappear. "It's still out there," I said quietly. "I know," Lewis replied grimly, "but we'll keep moving and stay alert. You did well to survive this. Long." Once he'd finished rewrapping my bandages, we doused the fire and prepared to leave. I followed closely behind him, every rustle and crack in the forest making my heart leap. The path to the station was uneven and winding, but Lewis kept a steady pace, his rifle at the ready. "What happens if it shows up again?" I asked, my voice low. "We handle it," Lewis said without looking back. His confidence was both reassuring and unnerving. The station came into view just as the sun began its slow descent. It was a small weathered building, surrounded by a clearing that offered better visibility. Lewis led me inside and secured the door behind us. "You'll be safe here," he said, setting his rifle by the window. "I'll keep watch outside." I nodded, sinking onto a cot in the corner. The exhaustion hit me all at once, and I let my eyes close, the faint hum of the ranger's radio lulling me into a restless sleep. The ranger station felt secure, but it did little to quiet the storm raging in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the grizzly's massive frame, its teeth bared and claws slicing through the air. My chest throbbed with every breath, a cruel reminder of how close I'd come to death. Ranger Lewis was a stoic presence, moving efficiently as he checked the door locks and scanned the tree line through the window. He'd built a small fire in the wood stove, the faint warmth barely cutting through the chill that seeped into the cabin. "How's the pain?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Manageable," I lied, wincing as I shifted on the cot. "We'll get you proper medical attention soon," he said, his tone steady. "Just hang in there." I nodded, though the thought of another night in the wilderness made my stomach churn. The firelight danced across the walls, casting flickering shadows that seemed to pulse with every gust of wind outside. "That bear," I began, my voice hoarse. "Have you seen anything like it before?" Lewis pulled up a chair and sat across from me, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the fire. "I've been in Glacier for 10 years, seen a lot of bears, but this one, it's different." "Different how?" "Most grizzlies avoid people if they can. This one's aggressive, almost. Fearless. Could be injured or sick, maybe it's just old and doesn't care anymore." I swallowed hard, the memory of its black, soulless eyes making my skin crawl. "What happens if it comes back?" Lewis's jaw tightened. "Then we deal with it." The silence stretched between us, broken only by the occasional pop of the fire. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, a haunting symphony that set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that the bear was still out there, lurking just beyond the firelight. As the hours dragged on, the pain in my chest grew sharper, and I struggled to keep my breathing steady. Lewis must have noticed because he handed me a bottle of water and a small packet of painkillers. "Take these," he said. "They'll help take the edge off." "Thanks," I muttered, swallowing the pills with a gulp of water. The relief was slow but welcome, dulling the worst of the ache. Lewis stood and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "It's quiet," he murmured. "Too quiet." I forced a bitter laugh. "You say that like it's a bad thing." He glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "In these woods, quiet usually means something's watching." A chill ran down my spine, and I pulled the blanket tighter around me. I wanted to dismiss his words as paranoia, but after what I'd been through, I couldn't. The forest had its own rules, and I was an outsider, a trespasser. The minutes crawled by, each one feeling like an hour. I tried to distract myself by counting the cracks in the ceiling, but my thoughts kept circling back to the bear. What had provoked it? Was it hunting me, or was I just unlucky enough to cross its path? A sudden thud against the side of the cabin jolted me upright, my heart racing. Lewis grabbed his rifle and moved to the door, his movements swift and practiced. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice low but firm. "What was that?" I asked, my throat dry. "Could be the wind," he said, though the tightness in his voice told me he didn't believe it. He cracked the door open just enough to peer outside, the cold night air rushing in and making the fire flicker. For a moment he stood motionless, his body tense like a coiled spring. "Anything?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Lewis shut the door and locked it, his eyes narrowing. "Nothing I can see." Another thud echoed through the cabin, this time from the roof. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities. "That's not the wind," I said, my voice trembling. Lewis nodded, his grip tightening on the rifle. "Stay by the fire. If anything happens, don't hesitate to use that hatchet." I picked up the hatchet from the floor, my hands slick with sweat. Every muscle in my body was screaming to run, but there was nowhere to go. The cabin felt both like a sanctuary and a trap. For several agonizing minutes we waited, the tension thick enough to choke on. The wind outside picked up, but it wasn't enough to mask the sound of something heavy moving across the roof. The bear's guttural growl rolled through the air, vibrating through the walls. Lewis moved to the center of the room, his rifle trained on the ceiling. "It's testing us," he said under his breath, "looking for a way in." The growl grew louder, more insistent, followed by the sharp scrape of claws against wood. My grip on the hatchet tightened as fear threatened to paralyze me. The bear's sheer determination was terrifying, a primal force that couldn't be reasoned with. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "We wait," Lewis said, his eyes never leaving the ceiling. "It'll either give up or—" A deafening crash cut him off as part of the roof caved in, sending a shower of wood and debris into the room. I threw myself to the ground, shielding my head as the bear's massive paw swiped through the opening. "Get back!" Lewis shouted, firing a shot through the gap. The deafening crack of the rifle echoed through the cabin, and the bear roared in fury, retreating just enough to pull its paw back. "Reload!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. The hatchet felt pitifully small in my hands as I moved closer to Lewis. He fired another shot and the bear let out a bone-chilling bellow before retreating into the night. Silence fell once more, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing and the crackle of the fire. "Is it gone?" I asked, my voice shaking. Lewis nodded, lowering the rifle. "For now." We stood in the wreckage of the cabin, the hole in the roof letting in the cold night air. My hands were still trembling, but I forced myself to take a deep breath. "That was too close," I muttered, sinking back onto the cot. Lewis nodded, his expression grim. "It's not over yet. We're just buying time." The fire flickered weakly, its light casting jagged shadows across the walls. The bear was gone, but its presence lingered like a ghost, a reminder that in this wilderness we were the intruders. The first light of dawn seeped through the jagged hole in the cabin roof, casting pale streaks across the splintered floorboards. The fire had burned low during the night, and the cold gnawed at my bones. Every breath felt like a struggle, a sharp reminder of the bear's assault. Despite the faint relief of daybreak, the sense of danger still clung to the air. "Ranger." Lewis stirred from his spot near the door, his rifle resting across his lap. He'd barely slept, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter through the broken window. When he noticed me shifting on the cot, he gave a slight nod. "You holding up?" he asked, his voice rough with fatigue. "Barely," I croaked, trying to sit up. Pain lanced through my chest and I sucked in a sharp breath. "But I'm alive." "That's the important part," Lewis said. "The team should be here soon. Weather's cleared up enough for the chopper." I nodded, though the promise of rescue felt distant and unreal. I couldn't shake the image of the bear's massive paw crashing through the roof, the raw force of its presence. Lewis stood and stretched, wincing as his own muscles protested. He moved to the stove and added more wood to the embers. "We need to keep this fire going. Smoke will help signal the chopper." I watched him work, grateful for his calm efficiency. "You ever deal with something like this before?" I asked. He paused, considering the question. "Not quite like this," he admitted. "Plenty of bear encounters, sure, but they don't usually escalate like this." "Why now?" I pressed. "Why me?" Lewis met my gaze, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes it's just bad luck, wrong place, wrong time. You crossed paths with a bear that's probably stressed, maybe hungry or injured. That's all it takes." The weight of his words settled over me. Bad luck. It felt like a cruel understatement. A faint sound outside made both of us tense. Lewis grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, his body rigid. The noise grew louder, the unmistakable whir of helicopter blades cutting through the crisp morning air. "They're here," Lewis said, relief softening his tone. He turned to me, his voice firm. "Stay put. I'll signal them down." I watched as he stepped outside, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The wind carried the faint hum of the helicopter. As it drew closer, the sound growing louder until it filled the clearing, a sense of hope flickered to life within me, fragile but undeniable. Through the hole in the roof, I caught glimpses of the chopper descending, its rotors kicking up a cloud of dust and debris. Moments later, the door burst open, and 2 medics rushed in, their movements swift and practiced. "Eric Tanner?" One of them asked, kneeling beside me. "That's me," I rasped. "We're going to get you out of here," she said, her voice calm but authoritative. "Can you move?" "I think so," I said, gritting my teeth as I swung my legs over the side of the cot. The medics supported me, their hands firm but gentle as they guided me to my feet. My chest protested every movement, but I forced myself to focus on the goal, getting out of this nightmare. Lewis re-entered the cabin, his expression grim. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said, literally. "Keep your heads on a swivel." The medics exchanged a glance but said nothing. They helped me outside, the crisp morning air biting at my skin. The helicopter loomed ahead, its rotors still spinning, the downdraft whipping the trees into a frenzy. As we moved toward the chopper, a low guttural growl froze us in our tracks. My heart sank, and I turned to see the grizzly emerge from the tree line, its massive form backlit by the rising sun. Its eyes locked onto us, and the air seemed to crackle with tension. "Go!" Lewis barked, raising his rifle. "Get him to the chopper." The medics didn't hesitate, half dragging me forward as Lewis stepped between us and the bear. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stumbled toward the waiting helicopter, every step a battle against the fear threatening to paralyze me. "Come on, Eric, keep moving," one of the medics urged, her grip tightening around my arm. Behind us, the bear let out a deafening roar, and a single gunshot rang out. I dared a glance over my shoulder to see Lewis standing his ground, his rifle steady as he fired another shot. The bear recoiled but didn't retreat, its snarls growing more feral. The medics pushed me into the helicopter, the sudden roar of the engine drowning out the chaos outside. One of them slammed the door shut, and the chopper began to lift off, the ground falling away beneath us. I craned my neck to see Lewis still facing off with the bear, his figure growing smaller as we ascended. A mix of relief and guilt churned in my gut. I was safe, but he was still down there, alone against the beast. The medic beside me placed a hand on my shoulder, drawing my attention. "You're going to be okay," she said, her voice steady. "We'll get you to a hospital and you'll be taken care of." I nodded, though my thoughts were miles away, still rooted in that clearing. The roar of the helicopter faded into the background as exhaustion finally overtook me, and I closed my eyes, the weight of the past 24 hours pressing down on me. When I woke, the chopper was touching down at a small airfield, a cluster of emergency vehicles waiting nearby. The medics helped me out, and I was quickly transferred to an ambulance. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air as they began assessing my injuries in earnest. "You're lucky," one of them said, as he cleaned the wounds on my chest. "Could have been a lot worse." "Feels bad enough," I muttered, my voice weak. The medic offered a faint smile. "You'll heal, scars make good stories." I didn't respond, the weight of everything I'd endured settling heavily on my shoulders. The bear might have been left behind in the forest, but its shadow would follow me for the rest of my life. The fluorescent lights in the hospital seemed brighter than the morning sun, casting a sterile glow over the whitewashed walls. I lay on the hospital bed, my chest wrapped in fresh bandages, the faint sting of antiseptic lingering in my nostrils. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was a constant reminder that I was alive, though I felt more like a shadow of myself. A nurse entered, her sneakers squeaking softly on the polished floor. She was young, her dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, and her eyes held a professional detachment. "Good morning, Mr. Tanner," she said, checking the IV drip attached to my arm. "How's the pain today?" "Tolerable," I replied, though every movement still sent sharp jolts through my ribcage. "The doctor will be in shortly to check on you," she said, jotting something on her clipboard. If you need anything, just press the call button." I nodded, though I doubted I'd ask for anything. The less I moved, the better. As she left, I stared at the ceiling, trying to block out the images that kept flashing through my mind. The bear's hulking form, its roar reverberating in my chest, the primal fear that had gripped me. Sleep had been fleeting since I arrived, haunted by vivid nightmares that jolted me awake in a cold sweat. The door creaked open again, and I turned my head to see Dr. Harris step in. He was an older man with a kind face, his glasses perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. "Ta-Jung, good to see you awake," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. He pulled up a stool and sat beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a freight train," I admitted. He chuckled softly. "That's a fair description. From what I've read in your file, you're lucky to be here. Grizzly attacks are no joke." "Tell me about it," I said, running a hand through my hair. "Am I going to be okay?" Dr. Harris nodded. "Your injuries are serious but not life-threatening. The lacerations on your chest will heal, though they'll leave scars. You've also got a couple of fractured ribs, but those should mend. With time. The important thing is rest and following our recovery plan." "Scars and all," I muttered, glancing down at the bandages. "Guess I've got a story to tell now." "A harrowing one at that," Dr. Harris said. "But try not to dwell on the trauma. Focus on healing, both physically and mentally. If you find yourself struggling, we can arrange for counseling." "Thanks, Doc," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He gave me a reassuring pat on the shoulder before leaving me alone with my thoughts once more. Later that afternoon, a knock at the door broke the monotony of the beeping monitor. I looked up to see Ranger Lewis step inside, his presence a welcome sight amid the sterile surroundings. He still wore his uniform, though it looked more rumpled than before, and his face carried the weariness of someone who'd seen too much. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the chair by the bed. "Go ahead," I said, managing a weak smile. He sank into the chair with a sigh, his rifle conspicuously absent for the first time since I'd met him. "How are you holding?" "Top?" "I've been better," I admitted. "But I'm here, so I guess that counts for something." Lewis nodded, his gaze drifting to the bandages visible beneath my hospital gown. "You're tougher than you look. Most people wouldn't have made it out of there." "Thanks," I said, though the compliment felt hollow. "What about the bear? Did you—" "No," he said, shaking his head. "It's still out there. After you were airlifted, we searched the area, but there was no sign of it. Probably moved deeper into the wilderness." "So it's still out there," I said, the words sinking in like stones. "Do you think it'll attack someone else?" Lewis's jaw tightened. "Hard to say. It could have been a one-time encounter, but we'll keep monitoring the area. If it poses a threat, we'll have to take action." The weight of his words settled over me. The thought of that bear roaming free, potentially endangering others, made my skin crawl. "I reported the incident," Lewis continued. "The park will likely issue a warning to visitors and increase patrols, but out there, it's still man versus nature. You know that better than anyone now." "Yeah," I said softly, my mind drifting back to the clearing. The bear's dark eyes locked onto mine. "I don't think I'll ever forget it." Lewis stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor. "You'll carry it with you, sure, but you survived. That means something." I nodded, though the weight of survival felt almost as heavy as the encounter itself. "Thanks for everything, Lewis. You probably saved my life." "Just doing my job," he said, offering a small, tired smile. "Take care of yourself, Tanner. And next time you're in Glacier, stick to the trails, huh?" "No promises," I replied, managing a weak chuckle. He tipped his hat and left, leaving me alone once more with the hum of the machines and the quiet ache of my injuries. The day dragged on, the monotony broken only by the occasional check-ins from nurses and the distant hum of hospital activity. I stared out the window, watching the sky shift from bright blue to the deep orange of sunset. The wilderness felt a world away, yet its shadows still clung to me, refusing to fade. When the nurse returned that evening, she brought a tray of food that looked more like an afterthought than a meal. I picked at it half-heartedly, my appetite long since stolen by the memories that haunted me. "You should eat more," she said gently. "I'll try," I lied, pushing the tray aside. As the day turned to night, I closed my eyes, hoping for some semblance of rest. But the bear was waiting for me in the shadows of my mind, its growl echoing in the dark corners of my thoughts. No amount of distance or safety could erase its presence. For now, all I could do was endure. A week had passed since the attack, but the weight of the experience clung to me like a second skin. Sitting in the park ranger's office, the sterile smell of paper and old coffee filled the air. The hum of the overhead fluorescent light did little to ease the tension that tightened my chest. Ranger Williams, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a clipboard, sat across from me, his expression a mix of professionalism and sympathy. He set a digital recorder on the desk between us and pressed the red button. "All right, Mr. Tanner, let's start from the beginning," he said, his voice steady. "Take your time and walk me through everything." I took a deep breath, my hands fidgeting with the bandages still wrapped around my chest. I'd planned a short trip, just a couple of nights to clear my head. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Williams nodded, jotting something down. "You'd been to Glacier before?" "Once, years ago," I said. "This time I picked a more secluded spot near Lake Josephine. I thought it'd be quieter." I forced a bitter laugh. "Guess I got more than I bargained for." "Tell me about the first signs of the bear," Williams prompted. "It started when I was gathering firewood," I began, my voice faltering. As the memories surfaced, I found claw marks on a log. They were fresh. I knew bears were in the area, but it didn't hit me until then just how close they might be. "What did you do next?" I went back to camp," I said, my throat tightening. "I told myself I'd be fine if I stayed alert. But later, just after sunset, I felt this low growl. It was so deep, it rattled my ribs. That's when I saw it, just beyond the firelight." Williams leaned forward slightly, his pen poised. "The bear approached your camp?" I nodded. "It was massive. A grizzly, easily 8 feet tall when it reared up." I tried to follow the safety protocols, talked to it, kept my movements slow. But it wasn't backing off. I could see it wasn't curious. It was challenging me. And then? Williams's tone remained even, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. "It charged," I said, my voice trembling. "I tried to use the bear spray, but I panicked and I tripped. It swiped at me, caught my chest. I thought that was it. Somehow I managed to get the spray off. It worked, thank God. The bear backed off, but not far. It kept circling." The pen scratched across the clipboard as Williams wrote, in silence. Finally he asked, "What happened after you got the bear to retreat?" "I ran, or limped, back to my tent," I said, wiping my damp palms on my jeans. "I stayed awake all night, clutching my hatchet, listening to every sound. By morning I was too exhausted to think straight. That's when Ranger Lewis found me and got me to the station." Williams glanced at the recorder before speaking again. "We've had reports of an aggressive grizzly in that area, but your encounter is the most serious so far. It's not uncommon for bears to act defensively, especially this time of year, when they're preparing for hibernation." "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice thick with unease. "We'll post warnings and increase patrols," Williams said. "If the bear becomes a consistent threat, we may have to relocate it. But our goal is to keep both visitors and wildlife safe." I nodded slowly, though the thought of the bear roaming free didn't sit well with me. "Do you think it'll attack again?" "It's hard to say," Williams admitted. "Grizzlies are unpredictable. But if we minimize human contact, there's a good chance it'll stay in the wild where it belongs." The conversation drifted to practical matters, paperwork, formal statements, and insurance claims. I filled out form after form, my hand cramping as I recounted every detail of the ordeal in writing. By the time we finished, my head throbbed and my body felt heavier than ever. As Williams packed up his notes, he paused. "You handled yourself well considering the circumstances. Most people wouldn't have made it out of that situation alive." "Doesn't feel like it," I muttered. I can't stop replaying it in my head. The growl, the charge, the way it looked at me, like I was nothing. Williams offered a faint smile, though his eyes remained somber. "Nature has a way of humbling us, but you're here. That's what matters. If you ever want to talk, the Park Service has counselors who specialize in trauma like this." "Thanks," I said, though I wasn't sure I'd take him up on the offer. Talking about it didn't seem to make the memories any less vivid. As I stood to leave, Williams handed me a pamphlet on bear safety. I know it feels like too little too late, but it's worth reading, and if you ever go camping again, which I hope you do, don't hesitate to call us for advice. I tucked the pamphlet into my pocket, unsure if I'd ever have the courage to return to the wilderness. Thanks, Ranger Williams, for everything. Take care, Tanner, he said, shaking my hand firmly, and remember, you're stronger than you think. As I stepped out of the office and into the crisp autumn air, the world felt simultaneously too big and too small. The shadows of towering pines stretched across the parking lot, and a cool breeze carried the faint scent of the forest. For a moment, I closed my eyes and let the wind wash over me, grounding myself in the present. The bear was still out there, somewhere in those endless woods, and while I'd escaped with my life, part of me remained tethered to that moment, forever, marked by the raw power of nature's fury. With a deep breath, I opened my eyes and walked toward my car. The first steps of a long journey toward healing. The hum of the engine filled the car as I drove along the winding road back toward town. The tall pines that had once felt like silent guardians now loomed over me, their shadows stretching across the pavement like dark memories I couldn't shake. My chest ached with every bump in the road, the bandages beneath my shirt pulling at my healing wounds. I hadn't spoken much since leaving the ranger station. The weight of everything lingered, a storm cloud I couldn't escape. Even the radio remained off, the silence almost deafening. When I finally pulled into the driveway of my small home, the sight of its familiar facade brought a fleeting sense of relief. But as I stepped inside, the quiet felt oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards echoed too loudly, every shadow in the corners too deep. I dropped my bag near the door and sank onto the couch, staring at the blank television screen. My hand found the remote, but I hesitated, unsure if I even wanted the noise. Instead, I leaned back and closed my eyes, but the quiet was no escape. In the darkness behind my eyelids, the bear was there, its hulking form and black eyes fixed on me. A sharp knock at the door snapped me back to reality. My heart leapt to my throat and I shot a glance at the clock. I hadn't been home long and I wasn't expecting anyone. "Eric, it's me," a familiar voice called from outside. I exhaled sharply and made my way to the door. When I opened it, my friend Jack stood there, a six-pack of beer in one hand and a look of concern on his face. "Heard what happened," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Figured you could use some company." "Thanks," I muttered, closing the door behind him. "It's been a lot." Jack set the beers on the kitchen counter and grabbed two, handing one to me. "Saw the article about the attack. Pretty intense stuff. You doing okay?" I took the bottle and twisted off the cap, taking a long drink before answering. "Physically, I'll heal. Mentally," I trailed off, shaking my head. "I don't even know where to start." Jack leaned against the counter, his expression serious. "Can't blame you, facing down a grizzly. Most people wouldn't walk away from that." "It doesn't feel like I walked away," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I close my eyes, it's there. I can't shake it." Jack nodded, his brow furrowed. "You've been through hell, man. It's gonna take time. Have you thought about talking to someone? Like a therapist or something?" "Yeah," I admitted. "Williams mentioned it, but I don't know, feels like talking won't change anything." "Maybe not right away," Jack said, taking a sip of his beer. "But it might help you sort through it. You don't have to carry this alone." I looked down at the bottle in my hands, the condensation dripping onto the counter. "I'll think about it." We drank in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation hanging between us. Eventually, Jack broke the quiet. "You gonna go back out there?" he asked, his tone cautious. I shook my head. "Not anytime soon. Maybe not ever." "Fair enough," Jack said. "But don't let this keep you from living your life. You're stronger than you think, Eric." His words lingered as he left later that evening. Alone again, I stared out the window, the shadows of the trees swaying in the breeze. Stronger than I think. I wasn't sure if I believed that yet. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. Groaning, I reached for it, squinting at the screen. It was an unknown number, but something compelled me to answer. "Hello?" "Mr. Tanner, this is Lisa from Glacier National Park," a woman's voice said. "I'm part of the wildlife management team. I wanted to follow up on your report." I sat up, the fog of sleep quickly clearing. Sure, what do you need?" "I just have a few more questions about the bear's behavior," she said. "We're trying to determine the best course of action. Any additional details you can provide might help." I recounted the encounter as best I could, my voice steadier than I expected. Lisa listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she thanked me for my time and assured me they'd do everything they could to ensure the safety of both visitors and wildlife. After the call, I sat in silence, the conversation stirring up memories I'd tried to suppress. But instead of pushing them away, I let them surface, confronting them head-on. The fear was still there, but so was a flicker of something else, acceptance, maybe even resilience. By late afternoon, I found myself sitting at my desk, a blank notebook in front of me. I picked up a pen and began to write, the words flowing faster than I expected. I wrote about the trip, the attack, the bear, and the raw, unfiltered fear that had gripped me. The pages filled quickly, each line a small release of the tension I'd been carrying. When I finally set the pen down, I felt lighter, as if some of the weight had been transferred to the pages. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. The wilderness had scarred me, both physically and mentally. But as I looked out the window at the fading light, I realized it had also taught me something valuable. Survival isn't just about making it through the moment. It's about finding a way to live with what comes after. The air was crisp as I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching against the gravel of the trailhead parking lot. The towering pines of Glacier National Park loomed ahead, their emerald branches swaying gently in the breeze. Despite the warmth of the midsummer sun, a chill settled over me. It had been 6 months since the attack, and I hadn't been back here since. "You sure about this?" Jack's voice cut through my thoughts. He leaned against the hood of his truck, arms crossed, his expression equal parts concern and curiosity. "Not really," I admitted, adjusting the straps of my day pack. "But I need to do this." Jack sighed and grabbed his own pack. "All right. But you're not doing it alone." I nodded in appreciation, though the thought of anyone else being here when I wasn't sure what I was looking for filled me with unease. I wasn't here to prove anything to anyone else, just to myself. The trail wound through dense forest, the dappled sunlight creating shifting patterns on the packed dirt. Each step felt heavier than the last, memories of the encounter playing out vividly in my mind. The low growl, the rush of movement, the sheer power of the grizzly as it closed the distance. My chest ached, not just from the scars beneath my shirt, but from the weight of carrying that moment with me every day since. Jack walked in silence beside me, respecting the gravity of the situation. His presence was reassuring, grounding me as we moved deeper into the wilderness. After an hour of hiking, we reached a small clearing near Lake Josephine, the same clearing where I'd set up camp all those months ago. "This it?" Jack asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I said, my throat tightening. "This is where it happened." I set down my pack and took a deep breath, letting the forest sounds wash over me. The rhythmic chirping of crickets, the distant rush of water, the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was almost peaceful, almost. Jack broke the silence. "You want to talk about it?" "Not really," I said, my voice flat, "but I guess I should." He nodded and sat on a fallen log, giving me space to gather my thoughts. "It's not just the attack that stays with me," I began, my gaze fixed on the ground. "It's the fear, the helplessness, knowing that out here I was nothing compared to that bear." Jack listened without interrupting, his expression somber. "I've replayed it 100 times," I continued, "what I could have done differently, whether I should have even been out here in the first place." I shook my head. "But second-guessing won't change what happened." "No, it won't," Jack said quietly, "but facing it might help you move on." I nodded, swallowing hard. The scars on my chest itched beneath the fabric of my shirt, a constant reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. "You know," Jack said after a long pause. "Scars tell stories. They're proof you survived. They don't define you, but they're part of you now." His words sank in, and I found myself tracing the faint lines on my chest beneath my shirt. They didn't define me, but they had shaped me in ways I was still discovering. "Thanks, Jack," I said, my voice steadying, "for coming out here with me." "Anytime," he replied, standing. "You ready to head back?" I hesitated, my eyes drifting toward the edge of the clearing where the trees thickened into shadows. "Give me a minute." Jack nodded and walked a few paces away, giving me space. I approached the spot where my tent had been, the memory of that night vivid. Kneeling, I placed my hand on the cool earth, grounding myself in the present. "I'm still here," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. The forest seemed to listen, its silence an acknowledgement. When I stood, I felt a weight lift, the first step toward reclaiming a part of myself I'd thought lost. Turning back toward Jack, I found him watching me with a faint smile. "All right," I said, grabbing my pack. "Let's go home." As we made our way back along the trail, I realized the forest no longer felt like a predator's hunting ground. It was still wild, still dangerous, but it was also a place of resilience, of life continuing despite the scars left behind. And so would I.